Welcome to this episode of With the Shits hosted by Lana. Tonight we're going to talk about finances and just corporate work environment through the eyes of a Black woman. And we're going to be speaking with Cara Bryce. She is a senior auditor for Deloitte, which is an international firm. And I say that only because it gives her experience and a lot of opportunities that are diverse. So I mentioned that solely for that purpose alone. She's a very dynamic person. I've met her through a very close relationship of my own, and I'm really proud and happy that she agreed to speak with us about her experiences in the corporate world, being a Black woman, and all that comes with that. So welcome, Cara.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. Oh, thank you for that lovely intro too. You're so sweet and kind.
Yeah, no. I mean, it's truly heartfelt, and we have our little sisterly bond. So this is really personal, but it's very important for me, for her to be able to express it, because we've talked about in many different scenarios where she hasn't felt that she's had that voice to express certain experiences and things that solely affect her when she walks in a room as who she is. And so first, I just want to open up with, if you could just give us a little bit about who is Cara and what does senior audit look like?
Oh, such a good question. So, Cara, I am from Connecticut. I started my audit experience back in Portland in 2019. I went to Portland State University, graduated there with an accounting and finance degree, and minored in dance, so that kept me alive and active. But once I got into the accounting world, I spent most of my time working on power utilities clients, which basically meant I was working on auditing and reviewing the financial statements of some local power utility companies within the Portland area. And that was a very illuminating experience right in itself, because I finally learned what it really meant to understand a company's financial statements, really understand the breadth of what they're releasing to the public when it comes to public information about their finances, and how to really understand and read them as both a user of the financial statements and also somebody's a spectator, but also influenced by, for example, a utilities company. So that kind of opened my eyes to like the value in audit. And I started with Deloitte as an intern actually back in 2018 when I was still at university, and that kind of gave me insight of like, okay, kind of want to try and be a good guy in this industry. I kind of want to be able to see what we can do when it comes to managing companies and making sure they're properly representing their financial statements, which basically means they're properly telling us what they're doing with their money and how they're consuming and how they're actually investing in the community, investing in their products, investing into whatever they actually may do. And that's kind of one of the things that made me passionate about it. But I transferred to LA about in November, and yeah, some things that just kind of keep me going is my dance, my yoga, and helping me make sure that I'm doing something good with my career, which sometimes feels hard in finance because it's pretty shady sometimes out there. But overall, I love it.
So, um, so with that, I guess you also get to see the mismanagement of social. I know it was a big thing with companies at a point. They don't call it this anymore, but they were calling it social awareness, or it was another term that they were using, and it was a lot of corporations were using. It's basically their way of saying, "Oh, we're giving back to not companies, but nonprofits or things that have certain focus," and they were using that as a forefront to generate more interest through cross marketing.
Right.
And so I guess you may have seen both the good and bad, both financial and humanitarian side of that.
Yeah, it's actually a great question because I think a point to bring up because it's really still evolving. There was a lot of like charity work that people always have to check out just for tax reasons within itself and seeing if that's something that's reputable. But another area that's like kind of developing that I'm really interested in investigating more and just potentially making one of my directions is what they call ESGs. and that's environmental, sustainability, and governance measures, basically. And that's basically when a company is saying they want to reduce their carbon footprint by 50% over the next 20 years. What metrics are they actually using to evaluate that? So, like, what are they actually doing to not only measure and evaluate that goal, but how are they making sure that they're getting professionals and experts to evaluate it? Are they being accounted for in a way that's actually representative? And so it comes into a great question of what financial statements are becoming.
Right.
Because they used to just be net income, profit margins.
Yeah.
But as capitalism and the growing economy is showing us, it's really coming to a point where we know we need to have more of a conversation of what large corporations that have a large impact on the world
contribute socially,
what they're doing socially,
and especially since they're taking so much,
and it's so it's like
well, or willfully or indirectly or anything. I remember during college in one of my international studies classes, we were doing a case study on, I want to say it was Pepsi, and they were talking about how the case study was pretty kind of generic in a way, but it was basically talking about how Pepsi was pulling resources, especially clean water, from this small town in India, and that it was making it seem like it had reinvested water flows, but the water flows weren't gaining water, and then it was still muddy water that the town was receiving. And so it was a big thing, kind of just like there was a thing with Tommy Hilfiger and Nike where they had quote unquote sweatshops in Jamaica, and then they found cheaper labor in China, and literally overnight the whole company was shut down. People didn't get their final checks. People were immediately unemployed and
devastated,
asked out. It's really interesting when you start talking about that thing, especially when you're talking about globalization too, because I know that plays a play in the social efforts, because the carbon print one is talking about worldwide. It's not just in the States. That's one thing. And then also when you're talking about globalization, finances is hand in hand.
Exactly.
I mean, just for a simple reason, we see them, trying to starve out Putin through financial measures that lets you know how finances work across the board.
And the levers that they play, honestly.
Right.
And it's one of those things where, again, we're coming into question into this new era of how we are holding companies and corporations accountable to those measures, and further ways of acting in a way that's in service to our world, because we understand the gravity of where we're in with climate change. Even folks who are conservative and folks who are still well aware of the fact that they want to make profit and capitalism as their forefront mindset understand they don't have the resources. The resources are dwindling at a point that the supply chain can't maintain.
Right.
So at this point, the juncture
is exponential. It's not at their formula rate.
Exactly.
And that's the one thing when you have, and you probably know, forecast as opposed to actual, and then adjusted.
And that's one of the things that we call an audit, that we keep in an idea is fraudulent, perpetuation through management manipulation or misinterpretation of those inputs.
Right.
So that's one of the things that makes finance, I think, more complex, and why I stuck in the safe lane of accounting, but also, well, I shouldn't say safe, but more rigid in the sense that there is a large degree of management interpretation or potential bias impacting those forecasts that are created. And giving an example of how those forecasts can actually have a larger impact on society. The large oil companies that, have ownership of quote unquote different oil productions throughout the world, they have basically set their net worth value based off of them being able to extract oil from those lands.
Yeah.
Right. And now scientists are saying that if they do that the earth will be basically sucked dry within a matter of few more decades rather than centuries.
Right.
So while I don't want to quote the exact study because I can't remember at this moment, but I will say that the fact that they have now noted the fact that these valuations that we have for these companies are severely off because of the fact that they're valuing their primary asset off of something that they cannot take all of because of literally catastrophic devastation to our earth.
Right.
It's not just a oil rigging problem with one ocean killing all of the livestock, the life in the Gulf of Mexico, for example. It's literally potentially to implode our own earth.
Right.
So how do we reevaluate these companies? And do we acknowledge the fact that these valuations are off? Because
Right.
they can't do that. They can't extract. So it definitely comes into conversation now that it's not just a bottom line profit margin issue.
But then that also makes me think about, and this is in any industry, where will the black market show its ugly face on that? Because if you have regulation, you're gonna have black market.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like that's like yin and yang almost. You know, so it makes me wonder. I mean, because we have it even now. You know, you have the U.S. say plenty of times, or just say, you know, we've only had a few wars, but we have tons of undocumented conflicts.
Right.
We have tons of other titled things that are still to the general public would be war.
Yeah.
Would be a sign of war. With anyone who understands how war works, it would still be any minute. You know what I mean? Once you trespass onto someone's thing and you do things to their people or to try to impose something that's not warranted or wanted, you're pretty much saying it's on. You know what I mean? So like, it just makes me wonder where exactly will the black market bleed the rest of that problem.
I think for the way that I would consider like the black market for any supply chain and how there can become the regulated space and then the unregulated space that can seed a lot more harm into the world would be, I guess to give a no pun intended, like a living example is the sex trafficking industry and the like process and the sex industry. I think that there's a regulated space. There's some places where there is a strong regulation for sex work, and that allows for safety measures and allows for safer participants and overall just better well-being for all involved. And then there's the unregulated places,
right?
The sex trafficking,
right,
the folks,
right,
the places
right.
and spaces. So I think one of the things to be just
what which makes Portland being one of
the number one ports, it's like let's talk about it.
Right,
so
that is
I think coming into making and just like to the example of like how does these black markets really impact all of our global supply chains? Just like with sex work, we need to start recognizing what is happening,
right?
What is actually realistically the environment we're operating, and adjust the regulation and laws to be in full visibility of our situation. First example, Amsterdam, the fact that they have it legalized, they acknowledge sex work happens. Yes, so why are we going to put a blind eye to it and not put regulations and like safety measures in place?
Right.
So same thing with oil companies. We acknowledge the fact that they are very profit margin hungry, which means they're going to use dangerous practices to extrapolate as much oil from this earth as humanly possible. What measures can we put in place that acknowledge that that's their intention? That they are not trying to save the Gulf of Mexico after their horrible oil crops. Let's not fall for the commercials. Let's not like false narrative that they're actually going to be doing something. BP. There is a reality to what their intention is. It's profit.
Definitely. Especially when you're talking about, and this is, I know you've heard this a million times, it goes back to the bottom line. The bottom line is ultimately a very dangerous and visible variable because it can make crazy things happen. I mean, just for instance, I remember one time I was doing mortgages with Wells Fargo, and they have these crazy incentive programs for the employees, and they seemed off to me because you could do certain things without the person knowing. So for instance, you would add, which something would seem harmless, but nevertheless is without permission. You could add a background check, like a monitoring system on people's kind of mortgage or credit card if they called in, and like there were incentives to get people signed up for certain things, which ultimately I believe are just data mining really products. I mean, they're given free, but ultimately they have much more value than what they're telling you that they have.
Yeah.
But that's a whole nother conversation. But they had these products. They were giving employees a lot of incentives to meet these certain quotas, and I started noticing through conversation that people weren't aware that they were signed up for things. So I started asking them questions like, "Oh, do you remember?" Like, 'cause you can go through and see when it was added. And I would ask them, "Hey, do you remember this?" And they would be like, not quite." And I was like, oh, okay. So I had a conversation with one of the managers, and I was just like, I really feel that morally and ethically, I'm not a CPA, but morally and ethically, there's something wrong. You guys aren't doing this right. These incentives are held much to a higher standard, because they were, for some people, it was like whether they were going to get paid or bonuses. Like, it was so many different programs they had going on with these incentives. So I was just like, you're giving people this drive to get it, and they're not really getting a response. But if you actually pay attention to the program, you can add people onto these products and not notice it. It just seems unfair. It doesn't seem right. And the manager was just like, oh, they get paperwork in the writing. They get paperwork in the mail, and they can read it, and that should be sufficient. I'm like, that's not quite how it goes. And I remember just saying, like, morally, like, this is a slippery slope of the bottom line. This is like, you can't have all these false narratives of pointing the finger when you're doing unsavory practices from the gate. It's not transparent. It's no border to that, and you can't just have these incentives on the bottom line and not expecting them to have all these other varying snowball effects.
Right.
So, like, even just with them depleting, then you have, what devastation, more icebergs, more global, more like the earth concave. Who knows? You know what I mean? When you're taking out such a big mass out of something that's a sphere, everybody knows you take stuff out of the pie
Dwindles down.
Right. It has issues. It has areas of issues. So, but yeah. So okay. So yeah. So yeah. So the bottom line is not the devil, but it can be. But yeah. So that's a good and just insight on Cara, and just a baseline of her experience. Very, very topical, because she's a very, very talented woman. And I'm super happy that she's here, like I said before. So I also wanted to talk on, so I'm a big believer of I am black first. And what I mean by that is, I've been in situations where I've been, quote unquote, the person in control. But because I'm black first, when I walk into a room, I have issues. And they're not necessarily immediate, and they're not necessarily covert or up in my face, but there always seems to be a reminder of my color first at some point in turn. So being in a international being with an international company, but starting in a very homogenous state. How was that experience? How was it as you developed your expertise, and how was it asking for the basics?
Oh, it was tough. It was a really, really tough experience. Coming from Connecticut, I knew that Northeast Connecticut specific type of racism, which was intermixed with classism and colorism, as all of the spaces were, but it just was a different kind of intersectionality reaction. So coming up to Portland was already a different kind of culture shock, because they hold themselves to a very liberal position of thinking they are quite performative, as I would say, just of how they are, think they are behaving to be like pro-black, and when in all actuality they still have a significant underdevelopment of fully understanding their unconscious biases. And that was a huge plug word within our company, of trying to create trainings to help folks acknowledge their unconscious bias, but one thing that I struggle with, particularly from my experience in Portland, was just the overall ordeal of having a hard time communicating with my team. Well, I was really, really lucky to have some staff, some like managers and partners who had my back. I struggled to just feel that energy of feeling secure and safe. So while on face, they were great, there was still something that now when I transfer to a different office or just when I go home and go into different spaces, I'm able to acknowledge, I'm like, that didn't feel right though. So it's very hidden. It's very, can be maddening, unfortunately, because of the fact that it's not a full-on gaslight, but it is an uncomfortable environment that is being put in a lot of Black folks. And I had to have these conversation difficulty with like my peers, but also with the partners and managers at my firm, and really have that kind of acknowledgement of how much it was a disconnect with feeling like I could be seen in a proper light of as being competent. And there was a point where I was struggling and I was incompetent. So that was really where I was having a real trust in myself and my own process and training.
Do you think that was a normal stage though, or was that just something that you were going through? Like, do you think that at the area or level of expertise that you were at, do you think that would have been normal hadn't you thought that there were higher stakes for you, or do you think that it was a normal, like it was just you kind of were, you needed some help in some areas?
Yeah, and I struggle with this question a lot because it comes up a lot with my mentors and my peers, because they're all trying to support me in that development, and I can't help but have my own humbleness and acknowledgement of my own struggles with my learning curve. And also hear reiterated again and again from the folks who are Black within my community and at the company, and as well as with just in general my overall hearing from peers of their experience of how they've been impacted, and being like, there's a common theme here. It really comes back to the fact that sorry, I lost my thought there. No, it really comes back to the fact that
there's
folks,
some loud neighbors.
Yeah, folks really have been supportive of me, but also at the same time not fully transparent with me on where I needed development areas. And to get into that further, I think I struggled, and something that I try and counsel a lot of my staff and my peers on now is making sure to really demand the feedback that you deserve, because it's your career. And people said that to me, and I just became anxious with the idea of my career being in my hands. But one thing that I think could be placed more gently is the fact that it's in your power and in totally your strength to take ownership of your career. Rather than it being a fault mindset, which I was insecure from, I came at it now from a perspective of, I have my highest potential in my hands. So how that changes things is how I ask questions. It changes my confidence of being able to come to my manager and professionals and really ask for what I need, whether it's a learning opportunity, asking for the conversation to have the opportunity to grow more in a certain space, or just ask the questions. I was extremely nervous in the beginning of the process, and so being a Black queer woman, it's hard because I'm already feeling otherized and I already have my own anxiety issues. So having to fully say, oh, they could have done better, it feels uncomfortable for me because I'm like, I know where I'm coming from. I am Black. But that's also why I think there is an attention to the fact that this is why affirmative action programs and programs that are trying to support Black folks in the workplace are so imperative, because there is support needed. Because there is a deficit coming from the Black experience. There is a traumatic trauma. There is a struggle on, and for some, not all, but for
I think
some,
it also needs to be for retention too.
Yes,
not just guidance, but retention.
There's a reason that folks fall off, and I don't think it's just on Black folks for not trying hard enough. Because if that's not,
if that was the case, they wouldn't have came and got us to be slaves.
I mean, in reality though, it's in our genetic trauma. The fact that we're survivors means that in our genetic code to survive and push forward and prevail. So I really struggle sometimes because I do hear, and I hate to say like the white man, the colonizer in my head who still normalizes things, behave like thoughts like, oh no, it's an equal playing field, but it's not.
It's not.
And so providing those supports and providing those counseling, whether it's just because, I mean, coming from my family, I was very, very fortunate to have both parents who went to college, and my mother is a doctor, so very academic and strong. So we did have those dinner conversations, and I want to bless them and be grateful for that. And I've learned not to say but too much because it contradicts your prior statement. And with that, my family did not have the same conversations that my white counterparts have because of the fact that we have so much on our plates.
Yeah.
We were definitely having conversations, but also we had trauma to work through.
Yeah.
We had a lot of different things that were disorganizing us from being able to really financially have those conversations. And again, my mother did a really excellent job of teaching me financial literacy. It's why I'm an accountant. However, I know that's not the same experience for most black folks. So
No.
that's where I have a privileged viewpoint of being like, even I know from my vantage point, which was very privileged, I still struggle to know how to do my taxes. And I'm 28 with a almost completed CPA. So,
Yeah. And you got to think about someone that hasn't been afforded certain privileges or given access to certain knowledge at any age. You know, you really have to take into account that, you know, everything isn't status quo for everyone. Even within our communities, there's levels to it.
there's
Levels to it. It's levels to it all, both good and bad. And I think that people being honest about what they contribute and how it contributes is very beneficial. And I think that that whole phrase "keeping up with the Joneses"
Ooh.
is a that's my family's last name. It's so funny. Such a funny thing. But I think that that phrase needs to have a little bit more human aspect to it, as far as keeping up with the Joneses. More not keeping up with the Joneses, but keeping up, just period, within ourselves, within our community, sharing financial literacy, sharing information that we're able to share, and not and building that trust within our own, so that we feel safe in having those conversations. Like, it's truly a much deeper conversation than just having the knowledge and finding trust. It's a lot. It's a lot to unpack. It's a lot to pin and coin and follow the red string to. It's a lot. But just knowing how to contribute and ways to contribute and what that actually weighs in is imperative, I believe, especially when you can acknowledge that you come from a place of privilege despite being depraved from other things.
Yeah. And I think it gives you an acknowledgement of where you're at, so you can be humbled and also grateful, but also and really connect and really have a moment of gratitude. And honestly, for me, it helps me relate to folks better in acknowledging myself, because it really takes that inward introspection of like, okay, this is where I'm coming from. Let's be realistic. I was afforded these amazing blessings of my family and my like education and my health. And also, I can now see from another perspective of those, the grass is definitely not always greener, and the Joneses, keeping up the Joneses is not always the point.
No.
I think one thing I'm so grateful for Portland is the fact that because it's small, and even I notice with this in the workplace and outside of it, community is highly valued. And it's one of the reasons you and I have connected and stayed so intertwined, is because folks really take that seriously of building each other up as well as themselves. And then I moved to other spaces like LA, which I do really adore and love. And it comes from a more individualistic. And America itself struggles with it being a much more individualistic country than compared to like Japan, which is traditionally known for very collectivist.
Yeah.
It's just part of our culture. But what does that really lead to? And part of it lays into capitalism, but it also leads into this exhaustion, because we can only do so much on our own. So if we're only doing so much for our own and only on ourselves, we can't benefit from the reason that global trade exists, because the idea that all places and spaces have their own specialties.
Right.
And we all do better when we exchange those goods.
Right.
Rather than all just trying to do it our own. That's why the global trade market exists. So if we think of that on a human level.
And it's also a status thing. So, in the beginning of globalization, those that could afford imports, it was a status thing. And I mean, even still now, I mean, you have luxury items now, and honestly, it goes from person to person. What they consider is what is what. But, you still have those things, but they become status or exclusivity items. And it plays into it plays into just, I think, also individuality, but also globalization is to set up the market. Like, I guess on my end, being international business, I guess I'm the plan to the accountant, and so like the reason why is what I've studied and how to account for it literally is what you study. And so like a lot of times globalization, it was, especially for the United States, it was for the baby boomers. It was introduced because they were also given consumer credit at that time. So you had mail order, you had a lot of things, and at that time, America also was the most amazing thing in this world. So you were thought that you were entitled to these things because you were the greatest country in the world and you had credit. Then passing it down to our parents, because I'm really kind of talking about kind of white culture in a way. With our parents, they were still given the trickle down of that. So still probably higher interest on credit, different terms, but they still were able to do globalization. But it gave you like a sense of exclusivity, or it gave you just made you feel that you had access or the ability to afford things that others couldn't. And I think it played a big part in a lot of things. But like, yeah, globalization and global commerce is deep.
Yeah.
It's super deep. It don't even get into global marketing. Global marketing is the devil.
Oh, I'm sure, and because that involves manipulation, and I mean this very kindly, but
Right,
manipulation,
right,
because it's
right.
manipulation of your market and your product for your consumer. But yes, that is a whole other devil in itself.
Right, right, right. So, I mean, so we have talked about your experiences in the office space being you, and we've talked about you and just a general overview of what you do and who is Cara. And I just wanted to also maybe touch on some things that you've picked up along the way while being in your field that you don't feel that we are privy to. Not necessarily like, here's some quick tips. Not like that, but just simple things that, I mean, in our community, even with people that come from even a slight bit of privilege, there's still things that aren't, you're like, wait a minute, everybody does that?
Yeah. I think the biggest one that I think is like the white man's secret, and also something that I even still struggle with is, and I'm going to say them in combination, the nepotism networking.
That's big.
It's huge
That's
because
big.
a lot of it is sometimes out of our control. We were just watching a show talking about, for real estate agents, those families that are behind
Right.
those lines. And
Right.
I think with any space, there is nepotism at play. So sometimes, yes, you will not have the background to feel comfortable, well, not comfortable, to be afforded the same privileges others will be, because they have that last name or because they had those parents. However, I think the man-made thing, the thing that can definitely be deciphering between, for folks, particularly in the corporate environment, but overall for any professional, honestly, because I noticed this with a partner who was a musician and really struggled with it on their end, is the ability to network and understanding how to get your consumer to buy the product that is you. And because we live in a capitalist society, that is it.
Yeah.
I hate to say it because I sometimes am socialist
And
in
that
my
goes
ways.
down to a lot of his branding, which is
Exactly.
a
Branding of
deep
yourself.
hole.
And it can be very tainted by your own insecurities, which is something I struggled with. So having strong networking abilities and knowing your branding, knowing yourself, having that confidence, and the follow-up, the power of the follow-up, because if you're be genuine, be humbly genuine when you're trying to connect with these folks. Don't just take everybody's business card, but take one, write the info on that person, of that conversation you had, even some key identifiers so you remember them. Actually take them into your being of like, okay, this is somebody that I had a genuine good conversation with that I actually want to follow with after.
Right.
That's strong networking. Not getting 100 gift cards, business cards at the end of an event. I want to know how many meaningful conversations you had and people that you could genuinely follow up with, that you could be like, here's a point. It was so wonderful to talk about dance and just share our dancing experience. That really was quite a highlight of my night. I hope your banking company goes well. Like, completely set yourself apart because you're genuinely setting an intention to be a person with a person.
Yeah. And it also creates other points of connectivity, potentially, or you connecting them with other folks. So I know I'm infamous for this, because of Chezzy's Shoes and real estate and all the other 3 million things I do and the business consulting. Like, I always keep in mind, or at least try to keep in mind, who does what. That way, when someone else needs somebody, especially when we're talking about Black businesses, when somebody needs something, I'm like, hey, I know a person. Or even if they're not a Black business, if there's somebody that I've like vetted and I believe that they're good, and especially if they're at least a person of color, I definitely make sure to keep an accurate note, because one, business is hard for us. Two, business funding is hard for us. Three, business retention is hard for us. So I always try to make an effort to keep in mind who does what, who, like, with real estate, like, who does duplexes, who does commercial, who does financing, who's a lawyer. Like, I always try to keep in touch. That way, if someone needs someone, I'm like, oh, I got a person for you. I know this person. And because you already have that rapport with them, they at least going to check the person out, that's really all I can ask. I'm not, because I'm never working on commission. No, my whole thing is that you guys need to know each other and you need to do business. And I don't know why you don't know each other.
Period.
Like, you guys need to be, especially living in Portland. I just think that it's entirely too small for people to be so isolated from each other. And I mean that specifically the Black community here. It's very weird to me how small this place is, especially being from Philly. Like, being from Philly, all of Portland is like North Philly. We still got West Philly, South Philly, and outskirts. Like, it's too small. Like, and even even with us, like, even Philly, like, we North Philly, they kind of don't chill with other people, but it's just kind of territorial, and this is a whole different thing. But we're like huge places, and I still don't think they should be doing that, but it makes sense because literally you can't really navigate a whole section unless you really take the time, if you're not from there. Like, you got to have friends there, or you got to date somebody over there, you got to party over there, or whatever over there, shop over there. You know what I mean? So it's a little bit makes more sense because it's almost like distance wise, and how compact inner cities are built. It's kind of hard to go through every street, know every little thing from North Philly to South Philly. But a lot of us do because we partied across. But here it's like they say they're on the other side of the bridge, and I'm like, but the bridge not even a mile long. So I'm confused. Why aren't you guys hanging with each other? Why don't you guys network with each other? And it's really kind of interesting, and I just think that it's really imperative, like you said, to keep note of what people are doing, because you can be that connection person. Like, for me, as a transplant, I don't have no loyalty to either side because they're all too small for me to divide, to be honest. In my brain, I can't even divide it. It's just too small. Like, I drive from side to side kind of almost every day to do things, and I'm like, I don't know why you guys don't hang with each other. It's just completely crazy. Where it's just kind of interesting, but it's good to keep those key points about people and the conversations that you have with them. I've never done it on the back of a business card, so that's really good to kind of note in my head. I usually take note in my head, or like, you know, in your phone and it has notes under their name.
Yep.
I usually put things in there because I have a horrible memory, and really that's probably where I'm going to look when I can't remember something, is in my phone.
That was something that I used. It was really helpful at so I was a part of a very cool club, an academic an academic honor accounting society called Beta Alpha Psi.
Oh.
And it basically would hold functions called like Meet the Firms, which is basically just like a student run like college fair. College job fair.
Mm-hmm.
And the helpful thing for that was the fact that you got to meet a ton of tables. So just like any kind of booth situation with a job fair, usually those folks have business cards. So again, it was really imperative not to just write down brown-haired guy with blue eyes who was talking about the local programs and the internships. Like really being like, okay, I met 5 people and yes, I got 5 business cards, but one person I talked with for 10 minutes. And we were talking about the company as well, but also talking about being little siblings and how being the youngest and how funny it is to follow in people's footsteps and having the same last name. That's what you put on the back of the card.
Right.
Little sibling club. And then when you send your email being like, hey, it was really great to like talk about something that wasn't just also about the career. I feel like I really had a genuine connection, because there was a genuine connection. And that will just help you keep note. And again, I sometimes just struggle with my own quote unquote competency, so I do that for my memory's sake and just keep myself accountable. But if you can remember it, that's great. But I think just don't be fake. People really can smell that, and people can remember it. And I will really always kind of remember, because it's laid true for myself when I think about people. People don't really remember what you say, but they remember how you make them feel.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
Because I always get super insecure about, oh God, I said that right, or oh God, I stood up on stage and just spoke so fast. And it's like, okay, is it what you said or how you felt? Okay, yeah, you felt awkward and anxious. Yeah, probably what they remembered it as. That's okay. But that was a really living memory for me, just to calm down and recognize, like, what's the effect I want to have in this space? What's the effect I want to have with this one person, this one interaction? Am I going to be present and like my genuine self?
Right.
Am I going to be performative? Is it going to come off awkward, or is it going to come off nervous?
It's like intentional movement.
Exactly.
Intentional speech. Intentional movement.
That's why I love dance, because it always comes back sometimes to the body and that connection that you have with yourself to really
that's
tune
natural.
in.
Especially when you're doing free form, it's natural. You just
go.
Yep, you just go, which is nice. That's super nice. So, I guess since we're on the topic about dancing,
yes,
since I know you are formally trained, and I had probably a year of ballet.
Okay.
In an all-white Catholic school in Baltimore.
Oh, yes.
Yes. Lovely. Which is why, probably a good portion of why I didn't continue. Also, my mom was a workaholic, so she wasn't able to attend the recital. So I think that also affected me.
Yeah.
But how was that for you? How was your class dynamic? How was it being dancing? How was it being... Because I just feel like even at that young age, I felt sexualized.
Oh.
At that young age, and I was in, let's see, Cardinal Sheehan is elementary. So I was in elementary school. So I wouldn't say I had boobs yet. But I still felt, by the female dance instructor, I felt awkward.
Yeah. Oh, well, I will say that this could be like a whole part 2.
Right.
Because I can spend just as much time talking about my feelings towards dance in that community as I can about counting in my community there now, presently. And my dance community is still evolving, but it's just much less percentage of my life. But my background in it, I also started in an all-white dance school when I was, I believe, maybe 6 or 7, starting with tap and jazz. And, no, I'm sorry, tap and ballet. How dare I forget? And that really also, was beautiful space for me because I do love the instructors and like what I was able to gain when it comes to this poise and my body awareness. And I was quite proud to be a dancer. However,
It does give you arrogance.
Oh,
it gives
did
you
you hear
so
it in
much
my voice?
arrogance.
Did you hear it in my voice?
It just does. I mean, it does. It does give you arrogance.
Yeah.
Because I remember that was probably the year I gained all the cockiness that anybody knows me to have now. It's probably that one year.
I missed a little of it, but I definitely caught some of the bug because I was still very insecure, very, very insecure. But I think that was because the combination of being black in that environment and being, having a butt and always, I'll never forget, my ballet teacher would always like tell me to tuck my, because you have to have for ballet positioning, particularly when you're like first position, you tuck your tailbone.
Right. Oh, that. Oh, goodness.
And they would always tell me I wasn't tucking my tailbone. And now looking back, it's because I had a butt before most folks. So it looked like, and I'm maybe a couple times definitely needed it because you can tell in your hips. So I'm sure that I want to give my teacher some credit. Like, but it just was wild to me that I was so insecure about my butt. Particularly from ballet and at a young age learning that I didn't have the same shape as folks in my class. And coming up from a suburb in Connecticut, I always had my share of whiteness surroundings, but continuing into dance space, it was again another class privilege thing where dance classes are expensive.
They are.
They're expensive.
And not just the classes. We're talking about the equipment, the recitals, the places.
Oh, there's a whole lot involved. So having that line as well dividing me from further from community members and further from my black community,
the time for preparation. Just putting your hair in a bun.
All of that. Not having that frizzy halo that was so common for me that I think there must have been some of that to it because I spent a lot of time, looking at myself in the mirror. And to this day, I struggle with an eating disorder because of so much body image issues of just constantly seeing myself and looking and analyzing. And in my hair, coming of that conversation, I mean, when my mom caught me when I was like, I guess probably 8 or 9, it was cutting my hair with her hair scissors in the middle of the night because I wanted to get rid of my frizzies, and she washed my head right there and showed me how I just made like myself have some bald patches basically because I didn't understand that frizzies I thought that if I could just cut them off I'd have hair like the girls in my class. So there's a lot of things that dance really gave to me, and this body love, but also was a lot of body hating in the process and body shame. So I take that lesson. I look at other not even young girls now and children, and really empathize for them for their processes. They like find their body and figure it out in that space that can be very sacred, but also can be very toxic if not safely secured.
Definitely. I know I was the tallest. Actually, I was the tallest in I was the tallest in all my classes, I think, until I went to 9th grade or 10th grade in high school. I think, because I was, at one point, I was the tallest girl or boy. Then I think came like 8th grade, I was the tallest girl. And then, I felt like a giant around those tiny little girls. But I guess it didn't quite affect me so negatively because I come from a giant family.
Yeah.
So I'm used to
seeing
people being almost 7 feet around tiny little people, and it being like, you know what I mean? So it's kind of like, oh, I'm a Jones. That's what we do. We're giants.
We tower over.
Right. We're just tall people. Yes. Yeah. It's really interesting. I definitely probably will retouch maybe on another time about dance. Dance is it's a very interesting community, especially when you start talking about a lot of things. I know one thing I'll never forget. Even as a kid, I remember this. My teacher always assumed that I couldn't afford stuff. And I was looking at her like, Lady, I don't think you want me to call my mom up here and tell her what you just kind of said, but it would be like, oh, they believe that they're talking to children and you don't know. But these are the conversations that our parents have with us at home because they can't afford to have the other ones first.
Exactly. Our conversations are different.
Our conversations are different.
My mom was definitely teaching me about how to be responsible with police before she was teaching me how to do my taxes.
Right.
Like, it's just one of the games. It's just to keep us alive more than just how to create generational wealth. Like, we're just on different
We don't have that liberty to make that priority initially. We come out the womb as criminals.
And it's wild to me because I know, like, my mom particularly, and my father as well, I want to give him credit, but my family, my parents, did everything the white man told them to do. Everything. And still, me and my sister have our own issues as children raised by them to acknowledge. And yes, maybe we could be calling ourselves spoiled, but there's definitely some passing the buck of the fact that there is some trauma that is involved with being in the black family in America that we just don't get to have a conversation about enough. And because it's continuing on to our today, it's a living legacy that we have of this trauma that we are still grieving through. And they're doing everything right, and still there's not even the time and access and energy. The energy to really get into that.
Yeah, like the young lady that does I forgot what her name is, but she like, I'm gonna keep it black, but I'm gonna keep it brief. She does like the Instagram one. She was just talking about, she had a little commentary on Kim Kardashian's response to women in work. I will not repeat it as it is completely infuriating. Yeah. But she was talking about how dare she speak on people who don't even have the same 24 hours. And it's really interesting coming from an entrepreneur side, because in my mind at least, we do have the same 24 hours. But I know what she's talking about. Yeah. She's talking about all the anguish and the lack of choices that people have from jobs, and the stress and the exhaustion, too. and the microaggressions that are super macro right now, and the macroaggressions, and the blatant racism, and just a bunch of other different things, and then going home, and quality of living, and just things that are normal in a good portion of black communities. It makes it so that their time is not the same. And honestly, I still even believe, even with the wealthiest of people, their 24-hour sales isn't the same. Like, I'm pretty sure that certain stars still move the way that they move because they still remember that they're black, that their money can't buy them certain things. I remember I was listening to something Will Smith had said. He was saying that something to the effect of, like, he either used to or he still does, like, calls his bank because he believes that, like, one day he might just wake up and be broke.
Because that trauma is still embedded in him.
Still there. Like, he's just like, and it's just kind of interesting because when you think about, even when I heard that him say that, it was like way before now. It was like years before now. But it was just like, even at the level that he was at that point, to still be so on guard to think that someone could just take something from you.
Right.
That you've worked hard, that you've done what you were supposed to do. It's almost like the Ma Aubrey. Like, me and my husband had this conversation. It used to be a time where you could educate your children, and in your mind, defaultly, at least I know my parents' generation, I think our parents are similar in the same age, a little bit, is that if you got an education, you went to school, you would be fine. Nothing would happen to you.
Yeah.
Now, take in case Ahmaud Arbery. He was doing sports, he was well educated, he was in school, and he was still shot down. That drives me insane. Not only do I not believe anybody that is wrongfully shot should be shot, but when you start thinking about the psyche and how that contradicts a normacy that you felt comfortable with, that, oh, if I get my master's, I'll be fine. I'll be able to get a good job. People will believe what I say.
I'll be able to live in a safe neighborhood.
I can't even say it with a straight face. People believe what I say. No one will second guess me. I am my, not necessarily I am my accomplishments, but I've earned what I am. I haven't been given anything. I am competent. Those are things that you believed would happen, and now that's not even a thing. That's a farce. Yeah. It's a complete farce. And I think it's just like the second dose of like when our grandparents, like if you were lighter, you could make it home. Mm-hmm. And that went away, which I don't ever believe it was a complete whole thing. It's just they couldn't tell if you were black. But if they could tell that you were black and if you were light skinned, you still getting treated horribly, But yeah, I think we're definitely going to have to do a part 2, but we're going to wind this up because we're at the end of our hour. And I just want to really thank you, Cara, for coming and speaking and expressing and being yourself, because I know how precious that is to you, and how sometimes it can be hard because there aren't many safe spaces.
Yeah. No, I really appreciate the space and sharing my experience with you and your listeners. It's just been so wonderful just to like chat with you and feel so comfy. So I definitely would love to come back and chat more, particularly on the dance subject and just the environments of being a person of color in these very white spaces that we all occupy.
Right.
We should deserve to really take up space more than just feel
in
place.
Yeah. We're not just placeholders.
Yeah.
We are placers or placements. We are the place to be. All right, thanks you guys, and this has been The Shits, hosted by Lana, and we're out. Thanks for listening.